wars, nothing but stove wars, nothing but stove wars, nothing but stoves. Yeah. My man Bill Murray. All right, enough of that. Today we're talking about camping stoves, and I'm just going to jump right off the bat here and say that, this is my opinion on camping stoves, and my opinion may not hold that much weight to people who have been doing this for 10, 20 years. I've been like camping, all my life, kind of like as a kid and stuff, but I've been really kind of getting serious the last couple of years and have really gotten into it, and it's kind of turned into an obsession of mine. And so with that has come me buying a lot of stuff that I want to try and I want to use. And so I see things that are intriguing or I think might be better. And so I bought a lot of stuff and have used a lot of stuff, and sometimes realize very quickly that it's not really going to work. So I'm going to give you my take on kind of 4 different types of stoves. We're going to talk wood stove. We're going to talk about gas, kind of like your canister type stove. We're going to talk about alcohol stove, and I'm going to talk about Esbit stoves. And I'm going to tell you kind of which one I like the most, which one I use the most, and which one's kind of like the most efficient, I guess you could say. Things to consider when looking at a stove is, the size of it. Some are massive. Like I have, a big Coleman stove that I bring car camping when I go with the family, and it runs on propane. And, we bring pots and pans and the percolator and all kinds of stuff and big Rubbermaids. But, I'm talking mostly about stuff you're going to take backpacking. So size matters. And with that, I'm gonna kind of talk mainly about the size that it includes all of its accessories too, because some stoves, like the Esbit stove is like 0.4 ounces and it's tiny, but when you start adding in the size of the fuel and that kind of stuff, it gets to weigh a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to talk about the size overall with the accessories, the weight also with the configuration of all the accessories for, a typical 3-day trip, 2 nights, maybe minimum within that trip, 4 uses. I don't cook lunches, or I try to not cook my lunch. That way I'm not constantly having to bust out an entire cook set to make my food every single meal. I found that right off the bat was kind of cumbersome. So I actually bring kind of like beef jerky and trail mix and stuff like that and just eat that for lunch, and that is good enough for me. I'm going to kind of breeze over fuel expense, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup and the breakdown time. And of course, the most important, well, I guess not the most important, but a big factor is the boiling time, the amount of time it takes to boil the water. And I'm basing that off of about 2 cups of water in a 750 milliliter cook pot. I'm going to talk about convenience, user friendliness, cleanliness, that kind of stuff. And of course, safety, because some of these may be a little bit more hazardous to your health and to the environment than others. So the first stove I'm going to mention is possibly one of the most commonly used stoves. It's kind of the rocket stove, the canister stove. Use the small canisters. The canisters themselves come in usually 3 sizes: small, medium, large. I primarily use the small one because it fits inside of the cook pot. That small canister costs about $5. I use the BRS Pocket Rocket stove. You get it on Amazon. It's like $17 or $18. And those small canisters usually will last 2 trips, 3-day trips, and maybe a little bit more. The size of that BRS stove is tiny. It's really small. It's like the size of a thumb when it's all folded up and stuff. Um, they can be bigger. You know, some other brands are bigger and heavier. I like the BRS. It works really well for me. I've never had any issues with it. Lights every single time, and it's extremely efficient. So the way I typically use this stove is connected to the canister. Obviously, that's how you have to use it. Um, but you can add, you know, stabilizing feet and a windscreen. And sometimes I'll bring that stuff. But most often, if I'm backpacking, I leave all that at home and I just bring the canister and the stove itself. And, you know, if I need to get out of the wind, I'll use a rock or a log or something like that. It's easy enough to find. So the weight of it itself is 0.88 ounces. It's extremely light. And when you add a full small canister, it's about 8.32 ounces with the fuel setup. The setup is extremely easy. You screw it on the canister and you're ready to go. The breakdown is very easy. You unscrew it and you're ready to go. The boil time is very efficient. I boiled the 2 cups of water in about 8 to 10 minutes. By far, that was as what I found in my testing to be the fastest. The day I kind of did all this testing, it was about 40 degrees outside. There was a good breeze. I wanted to kind of give myself not perfect conditions to do this, you know, because you're not always going to have perfect conditions. I didn't want to do this inside or in a garage or in a manner that favored one more than the other. It's incredibly convenient. It's incredibly efficient. Possibly the only downside I could say is that, you know, it's loud. It makes noise. It sounds like a jet. They're relatively safe. I suppose they could explode. I suppose you could knock it over, you know, but in terms of safety, they're pretty darn safe. But definitely by far, probably, you know, that stove is my go-to. If I'm looking to backpack and we're doing miles and, you know, that's what it's about, I'm bringing that stove. If I don't want to mess with anything, I'm bringing that stove. And we'll get into the other ones, why some take a little bit longer and they're a little bit more finicky and fiddly and you have to kind of baby them a little bit. So speaking of babying a stove, we'll talk about wood stoves. I recently bought the Toaks Titanium small size wood burning stove. It costs $45, so it's kind of more expensive. But the fuel is free. So I guess over time you might save money if you go that route. And then, you know, you could find ways to light this naturally and find, you know, brush or grass or dried stuff in the wild, or you could bring fire starters, whether you make them or buy them. You could get 25 little Weber fire starters for $5. That's so cheap. I make some out of like cotton pads and wax. You can use cotton balls and Vaseline. There's tons of different fire starters. I don't really want to get too much into that. But, you know, that will add to the overall size and weight of that cook system. The size is somewhat bigger. The small sized stove does fit inside a 750 millimeter cook pot. Inside, it comes in a little orange stuff sack. It fits inside the pot, the whole thing. So it's kind of neat in that aspect. So you can kind of pack everything in there that you need and stuff it all back into the pot. So, you know, it's still no bigger than the pot itself. The weight of the stove itself is 5.64 ounces. And with about 6 Weber fuel cubes, it's 8.15 ounces. Or with about 6 cotton fire starters, it's still only 7.02 ounces. Comparatively, it's about the same weight as a jet stove with the canister. The setup, it's pretty easy. It's three kind of pieces that nest together, and you gotta unfold them and then fold them back together in a different configuration, and it kind of stands up. You do want to make sure that you have a nice flat area. When I was testing this, I actually tested it on a piece of wood because I wanted to see how hot the undersurface got. And it did catch the wood on fire that was underneath of it. That's something to take into consideration. You want to make sure that when you're using these things, you are practicing fire safety. You don't want anything, you want to make sure you have a nice clear area. You don't want to just put it down in like a nice dry bed of leaves because you're going to start a forest fire. They are a little bit messy. You're going to have soot, you're going to have ash, you're going to have burnt material when you're done, no matter what. And that's kind of the point of the little stuff sack that it comes in. You can rinse it if you can, or you just tap it out, and then put it back in the stuff sack, and then you can put it back in your pot so that you don't get a bunch of stuff in your pot. You might get a little bit in there anyway, but I think that's kind of the risk you take when you use that kind of stove. The boil time now can vary greatly. I've seen reviews online where people get boils out of them in a few minutes. My experience took well over 30 minutes from the time that I started, putting the wood in there and starting the fire to the point when I got water actually boiling. I wasn't using the best wood. I was using kind of this very dry stuff I just kind of had around the yard. I don't really have like nice oak, but again, I wanted to give myself a nice realistic approach to it. You're not always going to find the most best burning wood, when you're out in the wild. So you got to consider foraging time. You got to gather your sticks, you got to find all that stuff, you got to break it all down, make your fire, that kind of stuff. So it is a process to kind of make your meals. So take that into consideration if you're going to be using a wood stove. As long as you have dry wood though, you're pretty much good to go. You're gonna have to sit with this stove and kind of feed it. The stove is very tall, so what I found happened as everything burned, that flame would fall, and so you have to really sit there and feed it and feed it and feed it to make sure that you keep the flame up nice and high towards the pot. So there is a little bit of learning curve and stuff like that, but if you practice with it, I'm sure after a few times you'll get the hang of it. Again, safety with this, it's tall, it might tip, and of course you have to know safe fire practices in the backcountry. And also, some parks may not even allow open flame. I know we have a state park locally, False Cape State Park. They don't allow these types of stoves. You can use a jet stove, alcohol, or Esbit stove out in that park, but they do not allow open flame like that. The next stove I want to talk about is an alcohol stove. I have the Vargo titanium stove. I paid about $35 for this. It's extremely small. I want to like alcohol. I really do. And maybe I don't have the right stove. I want to try some others. I really like the idea of it. But this Vargo titanium stove, I just don't like it. It always burns through the fuel before I get a nice boil. So you kind of have to keep feeding fuel into it. But it is small and it is nice. It's quiet. It's easy. You just pour the fuel in and light it. You put your pot on top and you're good to go. By itself, the stove with a windscreen, because you kind of should always have a windscreen with an alcohol stove. You kind of need it. It's 2.72 ounces. With 8 ounces of fuel, it's 11.25 ounces. So it's actually quite heavier than a canister stove or your wood burning stove. And I found that bringing a full 8-ounce bottle of fuel is really your best bet for a 3-day trip, because of the fact that you kind of have to keep fueling up just to boil your water. And then if you boil your meal and then you want to make coffee, you got to do the whole process again. So, again, there is a little bit more of a fiddle factor with alcohol, but again, I think if you like that kind of experience, then that could be for you. The fuel is extremely cheap. You can use just any kind of burning fuel in them. I use something called Heat. It's about $2 for a 12-ounce bottle. You can just use rubbing alcohol with this. And if you go the rubbing alcohol route, you can find that fuel anywhere, and it's cheap and it's easy. And, that's definitely a pro for the alcohol stoves. The setup can be a little clumsy. You can spill the alcohol. You definitely need a nice flat surface. You don't want to spray the alcohol everywhere. I actually had on my last trip, I brought the alcohol stove and did not tighten the cap back on my alcohol bottle and ended up spilling my entire container of alcohol into my food bag. So that was super cool. Luckily, I was with a friend, Chris, and he had a wood burning stove with him that he was also trying out. And luckily, again, it was only an overnighter. So the next morning, all we had to do was make breakfast on his stove. So it wasn't that big of a deal, but a lot of things inside my bag got saturated with this alcohol that I had to dry out, and it was about 30 degrees out, and it was a mess, but we worked through it. But just another thing to take into consideration, it can spill. The breakdown and cleanup and stuff is pretty simple. Most often you're going to burn through that alcohol, but if not, the Vargo does make it easy to dump the alcohol back into the container. So that is a plus. You can kind of reuse that stuff. The boiling time, I found, again, is really inefficient. It can take 10-20 minutes just to boil your pot of water, and you gotta sit there and wait for it. I personally have not had like a great experience with alcohol stoves, but like I said, maybe it's just the particular brand that I use. It is the convenience of it is a little bit temperamental. You have to fiddle with it. The safety, you can spill it, you can knock it over, and this fuel can actually be pretty toxic. If you spill it on yourself, get in your eyes, get in your mouth, that's probably not going to be a good situation for you if you're, miles into the backcountry. So that brings us to the last stove that I want to talk about, and that is the Esbit stove. This stove burns off of a little Esbit cube. I've been intrigued with these, and I've seen them used on different various backpacking videos and stuff like this. And Esbit makes this teeny tiny little ultralight stove that all it is kind of 3 feet and a little tray. You put the cube in there, you put a windscreen around it, and you're good to go. Like I mentioned, it's about 0.4 ounces or something like that by itself. It's tiny. When you add the windscreen, it's 2.12 ounces. So it's incredibly light. And then if you add 6 Esbit cubes, it's about 5.15 ounces. So it's the lightest that I found. But I will say the fuel is pretty expensive. On Amazon, it's about $13 for 12 cubes. You might be able to find them somewhere else for cheaper, but that's about $1 a cube. So every time you're burning this thing, you're burning $1 every time you use it. Again, you need a nice flat surface. I had a hard time getting the cube to light with just a regular mini Bic lighter. I ended up using a torch, and it lit right up. The breakdown's very easy. You just pack it up and put it away. But the boil time with this, I didn't get a boil out of a cube, and it burned for about 16 minutes, and the water never boiled. And so maybe if it was like very close. So maybe if you were making meals where you're only using a cup or a cup and a half, maybe the Esbit would work better. Or if you're making coffee or something like that, maybe for day hikes or something. The convenience of it is very convenient. It's very light. It's very small. It's super easy. You just pop the cube out of the pack, you put it in the tray, and you light it, and you go. That's super convenient. I did notice the smell that some people talked about, but you really have to like put the thing up to your nose and like sniff it. Otherwise, I didn't really notice. I just had to like smell it to see because I had heard that they smell. I don't know if that's like in your bag and it makes your food bag smell like that. I guess you could just put it in a Ziploc bag and call it a day. The whole thing is easy to break down, easy to set up, And I would assume it's extremely safe. There's no liquid. It's just that cube. The cube doesn't like melt or anything like that. So again, as long as you're not putting it in like a pile of leaves and lighting it, I think you're going to be good to go in terms of safety. Just again, practicing fire safety with all of these things. So to conclude, the canister stoves, the rocket type stoves, are definitely probably the safest, most efficient way to go. It's the least amount of work, the least amount of like knowledge that you have to know how to use it, fastest boil times, by far probably the most popular way to go. I would say for me personally, a wood stove would be kind of my second favorite. Like if I was gonna go with like a slow, quiet stove in terms of like alcohol, wood, or Esbit, I'd probably go with wood. It's just kind of fun to set stuff on fire, right? When it's safe. um, but the Esbit and the alcohol stoves, for the testing and use that I've had with them, are just kind of too unreliable. I want to give the Esbit a little bit more of a chance and maybe use that a little bit more. But for me, those two things would be maybe for shorter hikes, day hikes, coffee, that kind of thing. Maybe for those smaller type meals where you're not cooking or boiling 2 cups of water. This is just my experience kind of from a beginner's standpoint. I'm sure some of these stoves might work better for others. This is just my opinion for what it's worth again. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you maybe learned something, maybe not. um, but I guess the biggest point is just to go out and have a good time. So have fun, cook your food, boil some water, and I'll see you next time, I guess.